I'm John Rowland. Today we might take a look, or closer look, at some of the features of the big great grand door. 70 tons worth of steel, and of course when it was in operation the door would slide in front of the chamber on the rails that we can see here, and then the door had to be pushed against the seals on the chamber. Now, when it was first designed, there was a mechanism put in place which actually used a big ram and some rods to try and push the door from the entrance door at the back. Now, that didn't last very long, but if we look at one of these diagrams we have on these plaques here, then this one here actually is from very early parts of the 1950s, and it shows here the door in position, and at the back here there is a strange object which is attached to the main door, which is the entrance into the shed. Now here there was basically, it says there was a hydraulic ram, and there's rods here. So originally it was intended that basically you would push the door against the seals using this ram on the door, and there is still evidence to show where that was on the door. If we go around the back now, we can have a look at that. Right, so here we are at the main entrance, shall we say, of the chamber itself, and the sliding door is on my right here, your left, which used to slide in the rails, which we can see here. But once the door was actually in position, having slid across, it had to be then pushed against the main part of the chamber. And if we look on the back of the shed door, as I tend to call it, there's various bits of structure up there which we believe was used as part to be able to jack or to use a hydraulic ram to try and push the main part of the door against the entrance to the chamber. And if we come outside, there is further evidence of what used to be out here. In that, if we look up to the middle of the door, there's a whole bit of structure, and there used to be effectively a steel box up there which contained the main ram. Now, my understanding is that it was actually the frame of the door which actually took all this pressure when they actually pushed it, but to mount the actual steel box up there, we can see on the points where the door moves, there are being cut off at this point, on both one here and one on the other side. There used to be a frame that used to come out here which supported the main part of the box and the hydraulic ram system. Now, the hydraulic ram used to I suspect wasn't particularly successful from that point of view, and certainly there is some evidence they had a lot of difficulty in actually getting the thing to seal. Now, this might explain why they took between effectively 1947 or 1948 through to 1951 to get the whole thing into operation, because I imagine there were a lot of difficulties in getting the plant to work and working out how to seal the chamber and so on. So later on, and as we go back under the door in a minute, we will see that they put in place some more, you could argue, sophisticated and certainly probably much more effective mechanisms to actually allow the door to be sealed. When the mechanisms had been put in place to allow for the motorised driving of the door, which, as I said, we suspect was during the late 1950s, there had to be mechanisms also in place for safety purposes. Firstly, to stop the door if there's an emergency, and to allow it to stop at the right position when it is being opened. And on the side of the door here, we can see, firstly, there's an emergency stop which would have been used in a condition that you needed to stop the door moving in a hurry, and also behind me on the right there's what would have been a bulb in there, I believe, which would probably be indicating that the door is moving, but difficult to get in through here. We need to go round, I think, move around the old R-door engine. But when the door was moving, they had to be aware of them knowing where the door was. So we have a couple of limit switches here, one up here and one down here, which must have been used to actually indicate the position of the door as it was getting to the open position, closed position. And those would have been there, I imagine, to firstly slow down the motor and then cut the power to the motor at the appropriate time, so it didn't try and run into the stops at the far end of the rails. Okay, so as we saw around the other side on the main part of the door, in terms of the shed door, that the original mechanism for trying to seal this door against the chamber was pushing with a hydraulic ram. Now that clearly didn't work too well, and later on in the 50s they installed a new system which we can come up and have a look at, which uses a couple of hydraulic rams, which appeared to be much more successful. Anyway, to get underneath the door, the first thing we have to do is put our hard hat on, because it's rather low and health and safety insists. As we come under the door, basically we can see a lot of features of the door which normally you can't see. Now, the item we've been specifically referring to is the hydraulic rams, and if we can see it well here, there is one hydraulic ram on this piece of steel, and on the other side, on the other bogie, there is a similar ram. So there's a pair of rams which are connected to the wheels, and these are the wheels which allow the door to move in the appropriate whatever it is, tangential direction. No, not quite right, but anyway, move the door against the chamber. Now, the hydraulic rams were put in, we suspect, the mid-50s or so, and as I say, it appears to be a way of being able to try and make it easier to shut the chamber door. Now, at a similar time, there was further modification made, which you can just about see here. And if I remove this item here, which isn't, there we go. So the back of this is part of a long bolt which runs through and will connect to ducts which are on the ducts around the main part of the chamber. Now, this would seem to be a final mechanism to be able to actually seal the chamber. In terms of having moved the door, this device here is basically a large handle which is actually ratcheted, which would allow you to actually literally bolt the whole thing shut. Now, how this was necessarily done is difficult from my point of view to work out, on the basis that these bottom nuts bolts were fairly accessible, but there are those or similar ones on the very top ducts. Now, to be able to get up those ducts, there are in quite a few ladders around the place, like this one. But when you want, as we will see later, the spaces are relatively small, and I'm honestly not quite sure how people manage to get up and down on some of them, particularly ones at the back, where effectively you're squeezing yourself between pipes to try and move up and down the ladder. And for example, having banged your head, there's this one here which has got so little room as you go up. I really honestly have no idea how the guys actually managed to use them. But I'm assuming they were probably a bit shorter than we are, hence the need for us to have hard hats. And I suspect they were generally smaller people, and they may well have recruited from that point of view. And my understanding is quite a lot came from the Navy, and that was probably also true for the Navy in terms of having smaller people. Okay, so as we work our way through here, we see here another, how visible that is, but there's another basically limit switch, safety switch, which actually indicates when this whole assembly comes back and hits this part of the bogey. So as this moves, basically this will just move in to my right, and when it comes back at some point, that will provide an indication to show that the door is in its fully open position from the point of view of being as far away from the chamber itself as it needed to be. And as we proceed through, I climb over this lot. There's another example of an, I think, interesting ladder. So I'm really not quite sure how you would like to go up and down that particular ladder. But as you can see, what we have here is an indication of the heat exchangers that are in the main ducts. So as we look up, we can see effectively 4 heat exchanger boxes, and within those there are heat exchangers. And as we can also see at the back of the box, there are what are doors which can be taken off from outside, which would have allowed the people to actually have access to the heat exchangers as a way of being able to maintain them. And from outside there are similar doors on all four corners as well. But from here, we also, in the area where they would have been controlling the movement of the door in terms of pushing it against the chamber, and what we have here is the hydraulic ram drive. So the top little cylinder is where the surplus oil would have been kept. Apart from the oil which is down on the floor here, I don't believe there's anything left in there. But basically, once you've selected the direction you want to take the door, you would then simply pump this, and it does make slight squeaking noises, so there might be oil falling on the floor now. But that would be what would be pushing all the rams, let's say the one we can see over there, which was on the far side, and the other one that we saw on the way in. So those would be basically pulling the door when you're shutting it and pushing the door when you're opening it. And we still have the little labels on here which actually are there, which that one says, I think it says ram to pump, and I'm not sure, I think that might say pump to ram, but which basically shows how you're supposed to connect it up. And those will have been installed originally, I suspect, in the 1950s. Okay, so we've moved to the very far side of the door, and what we have here in front of me is one of the two capstan wheels, which are the manual mechanism for moving the door. At the moment you can see that this is actually restrained, because if that was let go, the whole door would start trying to move, because it's going slightly downhill, and it would probably run into, well, it would run into the end stops over there if it was let to go. But the wheel itself is still easy to move. It takes a little bit to actually start it, but once you've started it, the whole door can still get moved manually. And as I move that, you may not be able to see it, but it's actually rotating these very large cogs, and the cogs is driving the wheel, so the whole door is now moving, and I've now moved it about a centimetre or two. And if I let go, it will then try and come back onto its own weight. As I let go, I won't let go all the way, but there it goes. So that was the door moving back again by another centimetre or so. Okay, and the other thing is, you can see quite readily here, is part of the reason possibly why it took so long to commission the door was that the door itself has to be totally vertical and very precisely positioned, otherwise you can't seal it against the chamber. And if we see here in evidence of the shims that they had to put in by jacking up, no doubt, the door and then putting another shim in, and then there are four positions. This is one of the four, and the other there's another one on the top of the wheels on the far side and the front. They would have, over a period of time, worked out exactly to make how many were necessary to actually make it level and vertical at the same time. The other one feature you actually see on here is the fact that they were also concerned about earthing in here. There's a very large, probably difficult to see in the light, but there is a large piece of flexible earthing bond which has been fixed firmly to the wheels here, and the other half is fixed firmly to the top. Now, the whole problem that they would have been trying to counter with all the bonding, and if you go around the place, there are a lot of places where there are significant bonds being put in, is because the methanol was the main fluid used for passing the cold through into the heat exchangers which are above us. Any leak of methanol, then potential for a spark, as if you're moving things around, would be potentially could be catastrophic in terms of igniting a fire. So there's quite a lot of earth bonding that got put in, and I'm presuming that was for that very reason. And these days we have much higher limitations or restrictions on this sort of stuff, but they were still being quite careful in those days. And a similar issue in terms of potential for fire, ooh, he says, hitting his head, is can be seen by the light fitting, which is hanging all the way down from the top of the box around the door. And basically what you have there is a fire resistant fitting. So if you had a hot bulb in there and you had methanol fumes around it, they wouldn't be ignited by the bulb. And quite a lot of the light fittings which are original, and there's quite a few in here which aren't, but the original ones are all these explosive type fittings. So again, there was quite a lot of thought necessary to put in to make sure that you didn't have accidents. As much as we talk about health and safety these days, they were actually very keen in those days still about health and safety, and indeed as a result of that they never had any specific accidents that we're aware of, certainly nothing that was actually that reportable. Now we've come back towards the way we came into the door. As you can see on this side again we have another one of these capstan wheels. So this is the second of the manual door moving mechanisms connected to the, which you can probably see better now, or the gearing down the bottom there on the main wheel. Now later on, after they'd struggled manfully, no doubt, moving the door manually for a few years, they decided to try and make it easier. So what we have here is a motor which I believe went in sort of mid-50s, and the system was put in place and designed by the guy who was the chief engineer here, whose name was Joe Hancock, and he and his mates basically designed the system. So we have about probably a horsepower worth motor, and you basically have it would have been some belts pulley over these pulleys. So this pulley up this side was added to where the capstan wheel is, and there's a pulley on here. So basically you could actually then move the door. I imagine they started the door moving manually and then they basically let it go with the motors. And on the far side there are switches which are there to firstly as an emergency stop, and there is also some limit switches which I'm assuming are there to stop the door when you got to the right position. And there's a piece of film from Pathé which you can see on YouTube where the HRH, the Duke of Edinburgh, basically visited the whole site in 1958. That's a date I always remember because that was the year I was born. But on 1958 he came here and he visited the whole site, and this film shows at one point him coming in the back door where we were earlier, through into the main part of the chamber, and then there's about a 10 or 20 second section where it's actually showing the door moving under power, and I reckon it probably would have taken about 30 seconds for the door to have fully closed. So that probably was a lot easier at that point then than having some guys having to turn these wheels and then having to work out when to stop. So the mechanised system, I'm sure, was great assistance to them. Okay, so the reason we're standing here is to actually show the other end, as it were, of the bolts that were used to secure the door to the chamber once they'd worked out the best way of actually sealing it. And we saw from the inside the ratchet handle for turning the bolts, but here you can see underneath here one of the bolts, and similarly there's another one on this side, and you can't actually see immediately, but in the very top duct you can see there are further bolts which come through, and they basically engage with nuts which have been welded to the other side to be able to pull the whole door together. And I'm assuming that the little spigot you can see there was used to actually line up as a way of being able to detect when you've actually lined the door up correctly to start trying to pull it together. The other thing we can see here in more detail is all of the pipes that had to be connected every time you closed the door. So each of these pipes, including the one which is only a stub up there, would have to be reconnected every time you closed the door. Now, most of these, in fact, from what I can see, yes, the top three are certainly methanol circulation. So I'm told that every time they opened, or before they opened the door, they drained the whole of the system down of methanol, and the methanol was put into a tank, at which point you would then be able to break the seals on these pipes, open the door, and get on with whatever you then needed to do to put your next experiment in or whatever. And then once you close the door, you'd have to basically bolt all these things up again and then try refilling it with methanol before you then started running up all the pumps. Now, with all these sort of connections, there's a very high potential that you're not going to get it right and you're going to get leak, particularly when you've got high pressure methanol being pumped through. Now, that is one of the significant problems that they would have had, and the risk in terms of being able to have a fire inside between the chamber itself and the outside part here, which is the ionozote insulation. And that is why, the main reason why they had the fire extinguisher system, which we have seen before, which is the 70 bottles of CO2. And the top pipe, which doesn't have a flange on it, is a connection through to injectors on this wall, which is where the CO2 would have been injected in should there be a fire. They would have originally been painted red, but they've been painted in the ubiquitous silver, which everything else has been painted up with when it was restored in 2014 or 2013-14. Okay, so thank you for joining us on this tour around the Stratosphere Chamber door and looking at some of the items that are hidden away behind the scenes, and hope that you might come back and join us again in the future as we anticipate doing a couple more of these things about behind the Stratosphere Chamber, including potentially up the spiral stairs.